Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of Government Matters. My name is Mike Dobbs. I'll be your host for a conversation that I think is extremely timely. Just recently, 420 happened, and if you're not aware of 420, it's sort of the organic but yet international holiday celebrating cannabis and advocating for cannabis. So today we have two sides of the Massachusetts cannabis equation here. We have Payton Shubrick, who is the CEO and founder of Bricks, a dispensary here in Springfield. And then we also have a real live cannabis control commissioner, Bruce Stebbins. And Bruce is probably familiar to most of you here in Springfield because he served 2 terms in the city council. He also did a lot of economic development work for the city. He formerly was on the gaming commission, so he was very much involved with casino matters. Bruce, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure. Great to be back.
Payton, thank you very much for coming back as well. Payton's a return visitor to here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I've got a bunch of questions that's just sort of designed so that we can sort of take the temperature of what's happening in the cannabis industry in Massachusetts. I think it's fair to say that cannabis has been an economic driver for the Commonwealth, not only in terms of retail, but also in terms of manufacture and growing. And as any economic engine, especially one that, a few years ago, who would have predicted this? I think it's really important to keep our eyes on the developments in that industry. So let me first ask Payton, so how was your 420 at Bricks? Did you have a lot of customers? There was a lot of excitement about it?
Yes, most certainly. So 420 in the cannabis is the high holiday. I would compare it to Black Friday with retail establishments like Walmart or Target, just to give you optics into what it can look like. For us, the door was constantly open as customers continued to pour in. But each 420 is met with different challenges as folks are looking for pricing that works for their budget, while also at the same time we're met with the reality of challenges as it relates to software. Many operators experience latency or outage with a popular service provider called Dutchie, which services about 90% of the retail market in present day. So there's a combination of different factors. How do you make sure customers leave with product they feel good about at a price point that works for their budget, while also making sure that you can actually service them by having a point of sale system that functions as it should. So it was a combination of different factors. The team and I survived, and some would argue thrived, which is nice to see, but it's never a dull moment on 420 in cannabis.
I'm always intrigued by the fact that something that 420 was also had an element of protest about it because it was people who would actually smoke in public to advocate for the legalization of cannabis. And now you just likened it to Black Friday. So we've come full circle in acceptance in terms of society here in Massachusetts.
Oh, most certainly. And I'm so glad you mentioned that piece because I do think that just based on the sheer volume of dispensaries in the state, it is lost on many the original origins of the holiday, right? A lot of us are not able to have the conversation around the reality that while cannabis today can be accessed in a dispensary, it's much like food prior to grocery stores. People were still using cannabis prior to dispensaries being set up, and yet at the same time they had a lot more to lose in the process. So the elements of understanding the checkered history of cannabis definitely is lost on 420, which is unfortunate to see. But if you look at places like New York City, you have folks smoking in the street, kind of reimagining what the holiday once was. You don't see that as much in Massachusetts just because of how normalized it has, in fact, become. Unfortunately, as a part of that, you do lose the many people that were affected prior to legalization and their lived experience as well.
So, Bruce, I guess, first of all, I just want to ask, from your perspective on the commission, has cannabis been sort of a unexpected economic boon for the state?
I think it has. I was not an inaugural member of the commission, so I'm not sure that group when they had expectations for the industry. From what I've seen, and I do come to the job with that economic development background, I think what's been interesting for me has been the investment in communities that may not have seen a lot of investment. We know Holyoke did very well out of the block in terms of revitalizing underutilized warehouses for growing facilities. I know Payton can certainly speak to the hurdle to getting into the industry, but I think we've seen a lot of folks that are emerging in the industry, whether it's through our social equity program, but folks who are calling cannabis their industry and their day job, right? Certainly, we look at the revenue that it's generated for the state. We're approaching $6 billion in sales since the first dispensary opened 6-7 years ago. In December of 2023 was actually our biggest month of sales from dispensaries like Payton's and across the state. So I'm encouraged by the number of jobs, certainly encouraged by the investment, and certainly encouraged by the money that's going into state coffers.
I've got a figure here, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce. It was a sales figure for February, and $127 million in recreational sales, $16.2 million in medicinal sales. So, and this is a question for both of you. Is there any expectation or belief that we're hitting the ceiling in terms of the amount of cannabis being sold? Like, is there a finite audience for cannabis? Is that something that the commission has talked about? And certainly I want your viewpoint as well.
Yeah, you want to answer that one
I
first?
was going to say, you can start.
I look at a number of factors sitting as a commissioner. We look at the number of applications that continue to come in. We look at the high number of renewals that come up every month. We have not placed, as you know, in Massachusetts, there's no limit overall on the number of licenses that we can get out. We obviously have individual restrictions on how many entities themselves can own. I'm intrigued, and I continue to watch what is happening in Massachusetts just based on what's happening in the states around us. You know, Rhode Island is now legalized, Connecticut, New York, Vermont, Maine has had it for a while. So I think it was last summer I went out and hit the Berkshires and talked to a number of the dispensaries in North Adams and Pittsfield and South County, just trying to see what impact, even at that early stage, they were expecting. And I think it speaks to the quality of our operators, that they're working hard to retain their customers. Yes, they have people that come over the border still to shop at their dispensary, even though obviously we want them to shop there and consume in Massachusetts and not bring it back across state lines. But I didn't get a sense from those operators that I talked to that they were worried at that point. They're still seeing their same customers. I think it speaks to the operators themselves. How do they make, are they caring what their customer wants? The education of the bud tenders, those people on the point of sale interaction. How informed are they? How knowledgeable are they about the products? I think those are some of the key difference makers. And because Massachusetts got the foothold and got off to a strong start, I think a lot of our licensees established that market and established that customer base very early on.
Yeah, I would agree with portions of that, which say overall, I continue to see growth, not only with Six Bricks, but also with many of the wholesalers that we procure product from. So it is nice to see that despite how many years we've been legalized here in the state of Massachusetts, we continue to see the growth. At the same time, it's met with the burden of taxation, which keeps many of us as operators from really becoming profitable when you think about the overall dollars and cents that are being paid out, not only at the state level, but the federal level. And many would ask, well, I thought cannabis was federally illegal. You still are obligated to pay a federal income tax. And so thinking about it holistically, despite there being growth, there still is the struggle of making sure that you're paying all your bills and have something left in the bottom line. And I think that continues to be a challenge for many independent operators. It's one thing if you have the complete vertical, meaning you're growing, manufacturing, and producing, as well as have a retail. But if you're truly only a one licensee holder, there are a number of factors that continue to make it difficult because you don't have the control of how much the products are going to cost. And so I think over time, yes, there will be a ceiling that we eventually hit, especially if other states have a better rollout than what we've seen thus far. If we look at a state like Connecticut, there have definitely been difficulties with the lack of cultivators overall, but then also at the same time, the restrictions the state put in place, only allowing 14 grams, where in Massachusetts we allow for 28, not having concentrates in Connecticut where we have it in Massachusetts. So to Commissioner Stebbins' point, I think there's a number of innovative products as well as producers that continue to give us a competitive edge. At the same time, I think it's only a matter of time before that dynamic changes. And it'll be interesting to see how many independent operators respond to that.
I know there's been a lot of suggestion, especially aimed at the Biden administration, about legalizing, taking the federal statutes, changing them so marijuana, cannabis is no longer something you can get in a federal jail for. If that did happen, do you think that would be a positive thing for the cannabis industry in the state? If suddenly that onus of it not being federally legal was taken away?
I'll let you answer that one first.
Fair enough. I think it's an interesting question. I don't think it solves many of the things that keep me up at night, if I'm being fully transparent. I'd be curious in terms of how the commission actually deals with it holistically if we were to look at a descheduling, rescheduling, or a complete legalization. At the same time, I think that there's many things that are overlooked in the conversation holistically because there's still, in my opinion, a lot that needs to be remedied as we think about some of the current struggles that operators are facing. As we think about, like I said before, the heavy tax burdens, that doesn't go away per se, but does it allow us to actually file for a tax return in a way that many other businesses are able to do? Does it loosen restrictions around marketing and many other aspects? So for me, while the conversation could seem interesting, it presents more questions than clarity around what that means exactly, like I said, for smaller operators in terms of progressing forward. I think Six Bricks and many other companies like it are in a different boat than our multi-state operator counterparts that have clear strategies depending on the states that they're actually occupied in. And for us, it's more of a question of what does that look like at home as opposed to what does that look like across 6 states.
Yeah, Payton touches on a couple of good topics. One of those is where I see a little more traction on issues in the federal government. Obviously, you talked about what the Biden administration is pushing, but there's been talk in the Senate side of creating the Safe Banking Act. Payton, any of our licensees just can't walk into TD Bank or a traditional bank and get a loan. In the tax treatment, they're not able to take advantage of tax relief that other businesses are. So helping with those 2 fixes, I think, would go a long way towards shoring up some of the smaller operators. I think the bigger issues in terms of, production, cultivation capacity, and, how much is California growing, and what would happen when the interstate boundary border, guards come down. I think Massachusetts is still well positioned because of our testing standards that we require. So It's also going to be interesting to watch the feds kind of navigate these individual jurisdictions and what they have set up until the feds have taken action. But certainly the safe banking piece would be extremely helpful. And I think getting to the issue of taxes, treating them like any other business in the United States, has ability to write off expenses and other steps like that, I think that would make businesses like Payton's more competitive. But again, all waits on federal action.
Right. Looking online, I discovered a report that said that for 420, that the price of cannabis was its least expensive. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what drives price, the retail price that we pay at a dispensary. And what is that report, you think, actually accurate too?
Yeah, it's a running joke for many operators in the space that 420, despite not having clear identity as to where it started, does create a dynamic where we're discounting things in ways that are counterproductive to us staying financially viable. I mean, the reality of it is it's a holiday that allows many brands to get exposure that traditionally they wouldn't, but it's also because of them lowering prices. I mean, to put it all in perspective, in 2020, roughly around September, October timeframe, we saw prices drop by 38% in the state of Massachusetts, and they really haven't rise since then. And so it creates a dynamic where a lot of the pricing is controlled by the larger multi-state operators that have maxed out in the licensure for retail as well as canopy potentially, and therefore can drive the prices because they have the volume to do so. And so it does create a dynamic where you can go into a store and see a pre-roll priced at $6 to $10, and that's most likely going to be your multi-state operator that have a plug and play kind of outfit for how these things can be produced to optimize sales, so on and so forth. But when you think of a smaller independent group, for example, Hidden Hemlock, that's two local brothers selling local buds. They're not going to be able to get their pre-roll down to that price point. So they're hovering closer to that $14 to $16. So that's why consumer education becomes so important in terms of helping folks navigate the difference in terms of price point. But you do see a lot of the larger entities being able to control the price point because they have a more sophisticated business model. But also remember, they've done this in other states. And so they're able to get a better understanding of what does cannabis legalization look like in Massachusetts in year 6, because they're taking the experiences that they've had in California or Colorado and basically applying that same expertise here. And again, like I said, it really does create a dynamic where customer education becomes key in terms of combating that to ensure that you can support all wholesalers and not just some.
Yeah, it's obviously we've watched the ebb and flow of the price. For the consumer, that's a good thing, right? We're trying, I think the original intention, right, was to come to a price point where you could compete with the illicit market, the legacy market. So that's good for the consumer. They're getting an affordable, tested product as opposed to, something they might have been buying, in the legacy market. Obviously, we're still seeing strong revenue numbers, but I think we're acutely aware of what the price dip has meant to some of our smaller operators and allowing them to make ends meet. Interestingly enough, I don't think Massachusetts is following any different arc than other states originally envisioned, right? A huge spike as the market opened, California, Colorado, and then this kind of, bell curve in the price coming down. So, for the Commonwealth, it's good for the coffers, helping move people away from the legacy market towards the regulated adult use market is also important. But at the same time, I think we understand what those calculations mean when you're looking at your numbers every month or every day or in every week to remain viable and to remain open.
So the legacy market really intrigues me because it certainly still exists. It's not like it has, if anyone thought that legalizing it and selling it in a dispensary was going to eliminate the guy that you've been buying from all along, who you trust and you trust their products. Is there any strategy from the commission to try to deal with this, or is it just acknowledging that this is going to exist?
I think our biggest strategy has been the rollout of the first in the nation social equity program, allowing people who had been incarcerated, might have had a family member or a spouse that was incarcerated, to put them into our program to help move them from the legacy market into the regulated market. Our SEP program, which is, again, first in the nation, we're currently accepting applications for our fourth cohort. That introduces people and trains folks to be an entrepreneur like Payton, or if they're interested in, I just want to work in the industry and maybe a management level capacity, or I have great awareness of product, but maybe I just want to be a bud tender. So it helps introduce folks to those entry level careers as well. It also introduces people to, I'm an electrician or I'm a plumber, and obviously those are two valuable resources and services needed in the industry. How do I connect with the industry? I don't want to be plant touching. I don't even need to be licensed by the commission to have that access point as well. So I think our social equity program has been moving folks in that direction. We've had over 800 people go through the program. The introduction of the state's social equity trust fund is now giving a lot of those folks the capital that they need to move their business idea forward, because obviously there's a lot of interest in that entrepreneurial track. So I think that's one critical way that we've really been pushing, working in neighborhoods, working with cities and communities, get the word out about the program and hopefully show folks, a different opportunity to stay in the industry, but move from the legacy side over to the regulated side.
I noticed that recently the Healy administration, I believe, funded the equity program. I believe that they put in enough money for 50 grants that would range from $20,000 to $50,000. So is that a needed boost to the program to have that kind of financial resource that you can offer these programs?
I think it is. You're a social equity program participant, and Tito Jackson, who's a former city councilor in Boston, now a cannabis entrepreneur, talks about this all the time, like how much it took for him to try to get his business off the ground. And Payton and smaller operators have that same story. We saw the lack of access to capital is a huge hurdle for our social equity applicants. And if you look at the flow of our applications, we have folks that really hit a wall after they've been through what I call the paper phase or the provisional phase, right? I've gone out, I've talked to my community, you know who I am. Now I'm moving to that bricks and mortar piece, and I just haven't got the capital to do it. So I think the first round of funding was $2.3 million, went to social equity applicants. But to your point, Mike, when we start to talk to folks about we're trying to take down one big hurdle that's in front of you, hopefully that's an enticement to have more people join the program.
So there have been people who've been very critical of the initial legislation, and I know there have been tweaks to the initial legislation. Is there anything going on right now in terms of re-examining that legislation and seeing what it can be done to improve it?
I think the biggest changes we've had to the original legislation were passed in 2022. We refer to it as Chapter 180 of the Acts of 2022. It did a number of things. First of all, it raised the bar on social equity. So now you're a city or town that wants to host cannabis licensees, you actually need to come up with a plan for how you're going to support social equity applicants. It created the fund, again, to meet that capital challenge that was confronting a lot of our applicants. It also took down some of the walls in terms of suitability for working in the industry. You can have a criminal past and be allowed to work in this industry, with the one exception being you can't have had a felony for distribution to minors. But it dropped some of those guardrails for stopping people from thinking they because of something in their past, they couldn't get a job in the industry. And it also changed the way that communities now have to work through community impact fees. It's not just writing a check to the city or your host city or town anymore. The city or town really needs to step up and come to the table and say, we feel these were the costs that you had on our community over the past year, essentially, and here's a bill. And I haven't met one licensee that has said, they've all said, I am willing to pay for the costs that I feel I'm impacting my community. But this notion of just sending a check to city or town hall and not having an understanding of what impacts I'm having or how those costs are being defrayed by the money I'm putting in, you've seen some licensees that stepped up and were suing their host community and saying, I want my money back. So those are big changes and ones with big financial impact for our licensees. So, and the last one, I think, is where the industry can pivot and the industry can move, is that the legislature created the fix for communities to decide whether they wanted to have social consumption licenses within their community as well.
Okay, I got to ask you about the importance of expungement programs. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Six Bricks has done work with that. And can you just explain that a little bit for people if they're not aware of what that does?
Yeah, most certainly. So at Six Bricks, we were able to partner with Western New England University and other community groups in order to host an expungement clinic. We hosted one last year. We actually decided that we would donate to one this year, just acknowledging it could be uncomfortable to be in a public setting like a dispensary and seeking out these services. But basically, at its core, looking to help those that have records to get those sealed or expunged entirely, giving folks a fresh start, essentially, to what they may have done in their past. We acknowledge at times a 5-minute decision can stay with you for 5 to 10 years. So how can we help people? And it goes back to, our question around 420, right? At times when you're in a dispensary and you're picking up your sleep gummies, it's really easy to forget about the checkered history and the reality that you do have folks that had their lives forever changed from the same plant that you can now go into over 300 dispensaries and actually shop comfortably without a worry about how it's going to impact your day, let alone your life. And so the expungement work that Six Bricks does and many other dispensaries across the state do or should feel obligated to do is helping to, again, address some of the wrongs done prior to legalization and help folks not only be able to access their cannabis, but a fresh start.
So you brought it up, and it's on my pad. Smoke them if you got them. The whole idea of having a consumption element. Mm-hmm. I know it's extremely controversial, but I'd like to find out just what your thoughts are on it, the commission's thoughts on it. Several years ago, I went to a place in Worcester to do a story. They were a private smoking club. You had to buy a membership. Mm-hmm. You could not purchase any cannabis on the premises. And they were able to do that because apparently the city of Worcester at the time had an ordinance that say if it's legal to smoke, and if you're an adult, you can smoke it. And they were really referring to tobacco products as opposed to cannabis. So that was one sort of model that was off to the side.
Right.
I'm curious about just what the conversations are like at the commission about this issue.
We have been doing, as I mentioned, the first piece that we needed was the change from Chapter 180, which allowed either a community to have a referendum vote, but the legislature thankfully went beyond that and said, or your city council or town body can just adopt bylaws and ordinances to allow it to happen. We have had regulations on the book to allow for social consumption. We decided it was fresh time to take a look at those regulations. The original regulations were going to create a pilot program. So there were only going to be a dozen communities across Massachusetts that would be eligible to pilot social consumption. We decided to take that out for a number of reasons. One being we didn't feel the commission should be licensing communities necessarily. And we certainly saw a lot of active interest from communities that wanted to introduce social consumption. Since then, we stripped that pilot program out of the regs. We're looking at the rest of our regs and trying to come up with a lucrative license type that works for Massachusetts. So we've been having conversations with potential applicants. Right now, a social consumption license is limited to social equity participants, economic empowerment participants, our micro business licensees, or our cooperative growers. We reached out to them, asked them, what do you envision social consumption to be? We've looked at what other states have done. We've talked to Nevada, we've talked to Colorado. My colleague and a group of our team went out to California to physically walk in the space. I've been to your friend Smokey Joe's.
Yes, I know.
Closest thing I could find in Massachusetts beyond the Summit Lounge in Worcester, just to see how they operate.
Right.
Obviously, Smokey Joe's sells alcohol. We can't mix the two. But asking questions about air handling systems, a revenue model. We don't want to go through the process of creating a license type that at the end of the day is cost prohibitive and nobody wants to apply. We saw some kind of bumps in the road when we rolled out the delivery courier and the delivery operator license. We're making changes to those regs to allow them to be more lucrative for the license holder. You're going to hear a lot more about social consumption as we move ahead in 2024. We continue to keep the legislature updated. We continue to do outreach. We talk to folks in the public safety world. What are their biggest concerns? They've asked us to focus on training. We've had conversations with the many regional tourism councils around Massachusetts. They're excited because they think it helps to add to a visitor experience for a tourist coming into Massachusetts. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Our hope is to put out a framework that we can get some feedback on before we go through the diligent process of actually revising our regs and writing new regs. But at the end of the day, we're mindful of public health and safety, but at the same time, we want to create an innovative and lucrative license type for somebody to pursue.
Would these licenses be, would they be aligned with a dispensary? In other words, or would they be their own dispensary? So if you went to one of these establishments and you were going to consume, would you be buying product there? Or would you be buying product at the dispensary and bringing it in? Or would there be a dispensary with a door over there and that's our consumption area? Have you talked about those kind of details? Because I've talked to people about this and they're fascinated by the mechanics of how this would actually physically work. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And in some of the models that you've raised are what we have seen in other jurisdictions. You know, the big caveat here is whoever is hosting the social consumption space probably wants to sell you the product, or else they're building out brick and mortar for somebody to just kind of come and use to consume. We looked at Michigan. Michigan had 2 applicants for their license type that just was for consumption space, no retail attached to it. One of them already handed their license back in saying it doesn't work financially. Sure. So we've certainly have looked at some of those traditional models. I think what we're focused on is, again, coming up with something that's innovative, lucrative at the end of the day for the operator. We've been told that, you know, there are things to do around engagement, like a comedy club, coming to listen to a musical performance. One of the sites that we visit, or our team visited out in California, it was essentially an arcade. It's getting the consumer in, but at the same time, you know, similar to a bar. Are you just coming in to have a beer and turn around and walking out? Or are you going to stay, order food, watch a game? You know, what's kind of the engagement activity that goes along with that? The one thing that we learned from talking with our counterparts in Nevada, which just rolled out social consumption, is the executive director of the Cannabis Regulatory Authority in Nevada said, we wish we could have done more, or we should have done more, and asked the legislature for funds to do more consumer awareness in advance of the rollout. So we want to make sure that people are educated around what social consumption is going to look like. Obviously, the dangers and hazards of not feeling right and then getting behind the wheel of an automobile. So again, it's our working group is looking at the regs that were first drawn up, learning what we can from stakeholders, not only inside Massachusetts, but outside, and then coming up with a license type that works. We've also been introduced to event licenses, kind of one-day event licenses, sell product. People can kind of go, kind of building off 420. It's maybe not so much as a protest, but the outside opportunity to have consumers and passionate enthusiasts about cannabis have a chance to come together. So we're looking at all of that, and again, trying to see what works. And then it'll be really up to each individual community as to whether it's something that they feel they want to allow within their own municipal borders.
Let me ask one more
control
question.
is a big one.
Question about this. A friend of mine who is a retired police officer, it's not that he's against cannabis. He's questioning if you pull someone over for driving under the influence and it's alcohol, there are measures and steps the police take to ascertain if that person is impaired. Mm-hmm. One of the problems he has with the smoking lounge idea is what kind of steps do the police need to ascertain if someone is driving under the influence of THC, because it's, as I understand it, there's not a technological device that the police can use to determine that. So is that something also you folks have been talking about the law enforcement side?
Mm-hmm. We have. And actually, I've been through a class with a drug recognition expert to understand what those signs are. And they raise the same challenges that you talked about from the law enforcement side of it. How do I recognize somebody who may be acting differently? Is it because they have alcohol, because they have cannabis? Maybe it's a medical condition. We don't want to forget about medical patients who want to go out and have the same opportunity to consume cannabis with their friends and neighbors. Social consumption also takes on new meaning for people that might live in federal housing where they can't consume cannabis but want to have the same access to that product and do it in a safe environment, as opposed to trying to sneak a smoke in a park or something like that. So these are all the issues we're mindful of, but that public safety issue, right? There isn't a blood alcohol test you can have. We hope that technology will certainly come along, but in the meantime, training with drug recognition experts is going to be a critical step and a critical resource in this.
Payton, do you see social consumption an integral thing that your customers talk about, or is it something that you see a demand for?
Almost certainly. I think Commissioner Stebbins hits on an important part, which is those that are in federal housing, right? It's nice to be able to access products, but if you don't have spaces where you can safely consume without jeopardizing your housing, it becomes difficult. You also see folks that are coming in, and depending on their living situation, right? It's a matter of, well, I can't consume at home because perhaps my parents are there and I'm living with them because, student loan debt is still a problem in our country. Or it's the case where they want to be able to consume, but they may be living with someone who can't tolerate the smell and so many other factors. I do see social consumption as something that could re-energize the industry holistically, get consumers excited again. I think about it more in the context of tastings, right? And you go to a wine tasting, you're educated, you're learning more, being able to do that with cannabis and creating dynamics where you can have more of the science fair type demonstrations that allow folks to better understand the products they're consuming and how it will impact them. I think if anything for us as operators, it's really wanting a timeline holistically as the burdens around operating continue to intensify. Not knowing when the license type is coming out does create a dynamic where, respectfully, Commissioner, it's a matter of hurry up and wait because without a re-energizing mechanism like the adjustments to the delivery license type or social consumption coming online, you really have smaller operators that are becoming distressed over time. But I'm in full support. I think social consumption can do a lot to change things here in the Massachusetts market and level the playing field, because another piece that we haven't discussed is the tack chasing, right? The THC levels and products that create a dynamic where a customer is saying, give me your highest testing product, not realizing that, yes, you're going for the highest testing product, but it doesn't mean you're going to have the effects you're looking for. And so again, it boils down to the customer education that can be provided in a social consumption setting that showcase the difference of you can have a really good high and it doesn't need to test over 30%, but it's harder to explain when everything's prepackaged and being put in a bag and then you're sent on your way.
Let's talk about multi-state operators for a moment. I think, and correct me again if I'm wrong on this, but initially I think that the intent was to have this be Massachusetts entrepreneurs getting into the ground floor of a business and profiting from it. And now we're seeing more and more multi-state people coming in. And it's sort of the difference between having the mom and pop diner and suddenly finding McDonald's is building next to you. A couple months ago, I was intrigued to go up to Deerfield and see what a Cheech and Chong dispensary looked like. Because to me, you can't get much more of a concept than a multi-state operator than two guys who, along with Willie Nelson, Matthew McConaughey, and Snoop Dogg, are like the best-known ambassadors for smoking cannabis. And I found the experience to be very interesting. My point, though, is that having all of these essentially chain operators come into the state sort of undercuts the concept of having Massachusetts residents who want to get into a business being able to get into this business. Because in terms of competition and price, a multi-state operator offers something that in some cases they can't offer. So is this a concern of the commission when they see more and more of these companies coming in?
Well, first of all, I think the regulatory structure that Massachusetts created was to level that playing field early on, right? If you're a business interest, whether you're a multi-state operator or a citizen of Massachusetts already, you can only apply for a certain number of licenses. You can only get 3 dispensary licenses. You can only get 3 cultivation licenses. You can only get 3 product manufacturing licenses. So that was a way to make sure that the market didn't get dominated by a lot of those multi-state operators. I think there are some cases of multi-state operators who are moving on from Massachusetts and exploring the next frontier, whether it's Florida, should they have a vote and decide to legalize for adult use. So there is some shifting, I think, for some of the large multi-state operators. We've also looked for ways to encourage licenses that are specifically for Massachusetts residents. I talked about the micro business license, only available if you're a Massachusetts resident. The SEP program, obviously targeting people who had lived in disproportionately impacted communities. We've reduced fees, we've reduced waivers, we've expedited permits for some of those targeted exclusive licenses as part of our regulatory structure. So I think those have been big steps towards that, but we're mindful of the conversation. We're mindful of the role and the advantages the multi-state operators have. But I think starting with the limited number of licenses you can hold was a really strong start towards hopefully leveling the playing field kind of out of the box.
What do you think about that?
I think it's a case of in theory versus in practice. Yes, being able to limit the amount of licenses that either a private individual or a multi-state operator can access does in some ways prevent their domination. But if you look at it holistically, Massachusetts was one of the first states to have the amount of multi-state operators enter. And it did create a dynamic where, yes, despite the limitations around licensure, they were still able to dominate and drop the prices, as I outlined in late 2022. That created a dynamic where it did cause many retailers to become a distressed asset. It also doesn't speak to some of the things that the multi-state operators are doing. Now, I do want to go on record in saying I'm not anti-MSO. I'm just pro-small business. And what that means is that if you have 3 retails and you're vertically integrated, but not carrying any of the social equity brands available in the state, you're doing a holistic disservice. And so what you're starting to see is not only multi-state operators that have maxed out, but you're also seeing it reflected in their retail menu where 60%, 70%, I've even seen it upwards of 80% of the menu offering is all of their product, right? And so they're able to put in less than ideal dynamics as it relates to the customer experience by only providing their products or majority of their products on the menu. And it still doesn't allow, on the retail side at least, collaboration from a price point perspective and many other things. I think the SEP program has been helpful in terms of trying to combat that, but the reality of it, with just seeing funding coming through for many applicants, even the dollar amount, I mean, if we're putting it into practice, it requires $1 million at the minimum to actually own and operate a retail. $50,000 is a nice chunk of change, but in the day-to-day operations, it still doesn't ensure that you have a viable business model. So there's a lot of nuances that, despite the limitations that the legislator was able to put in place, still doesn't quite level the playing field, because if I have $500,000 in the bank, I can survive a tough month. If you have $25,000 in the bank, you can't. And those are some of the problems that we're really starting to see rise to the surface, with many people not able to pay their tax bills and starting to have to think about, what it looks like to decommission completely.
Bruce, I've often wondered about the advertising marketing side to the cannabis legislation. And I think it's sort of restrictive about what you can and cannot do and what you can and cannot say. And of course, I tend to compare it to the alcohol industry, the alcoholic beverage industry, about what individual package stores, how they can advertise. Do you think that there's been any discussion about looking at advertising and marketing and perhaps broadening it a little bit for dispensaries?
First of all, a lot of the limitations are baked into the statute, so that would require legislative authority and legislative change. For me, I think is we see the normalization of the industry, we see the stigma start to go away. I think there is room to do that. I look at the fact that in Massachusetts, your windows need to essentially not be, you can't see inside. But I've been to a dispensary in Portland where it was a storefront that you could see inside, you could see product on the wall, still going through the same kind of regulatory steps that a customer has to go through in terms of showing an ID and then walking up to the point of sale counter. But again, some of those changes require a legislative fix. I've been impressed with, again, I say this a lot, we're a regulatory authority for an entrepreneurial industry that is out in front of us, and sometimes the regulatory agency is trying to catch up. But I've been impressed with the steps that a lot of the small operators are taking to get the word out through viable means that, again, are in compliance with the statute. But, if I look a couple of years down the line, maybe there is a change, again, as the stigma gets reduced, as it starts to become more normalized that dispensaries are here, the industry is here. But anything right now would require legislative change.
Sure, sure. Payton, do you feel restricted by the regulations around advertising and marketing?
To be clear, I felt restricted since getting final licensure in this industry, but the marketing piece definitely makes it more challenging holistically. I mean, the reality is we don't have the options that many other businesses do have. And when you add in the fact that you might not have a large marketing budget, because as I said, if it's $1 million for a retail, just to get your doors open, that doesn't leave you a ton of dry powder to then also go out to the general public and advertise. And then when you're further reduced by the methods in which you can advertise, it creates a very interesting dynamic. Now, I can acknowledge that I was in a unique situation being born and raised here in the city of Springfield, where word of mouth and being on one too many nonprofit boards was a way in which I could advertise that, hey, I have a business and I'd appreciate it if you shop with us. But the reality is, with most marketing efforts around any cannabis company, you need to ensure that 85% or more of your audience is over the age of 21. And so if you don't have an entity that's willing to support you in doing the research or contracting with you to do the research, they're not a group that you can advertise with. And so when you think about the bare bone basics of, the bus that goes down the road and whether or not the advertise here sign is something you can actually engage with, that becomes a difficult dynamic. I know that many of the viewers have seen one too many billboards on the highway, but it's what you're left with in terms of how you can actually advertise your business, because you can't put on, an ad on the TV in order to get people to come in. And so it continues to be difficult. And one of the questions you asked earlier is, when do we hit our ceiling? When are there no more new cannabis customers? And I think the ways in which we are not able to advertise add to the difficulties in accessing new customers. Because I'll have independent conversations with so many folks who just don't understand the ways in which cannabis can be a part of their wellness routine. But how do you get that messaging across? I mean, there's no shortage of television commercials that remind me I might need a new mattress. Well, imagine if we were able to advertise the way in which cannabis could help support people in their day-to-day. And unfortunately, we just don't have that reality yet.
Bruce, there's been a lot of ink used to describe issues at the Cannabis Commission. And I know that right now that the commission is looking for a permanent executive director. Mm-hmm. You have an interim executive director. Do you think that I'm trying to use my words carefully here. I don't want to insult you, but on the other hand, there's been a lot of turmoil. Do you think that has affected the work that you guys need to do and want to do?
I would say this. You're right. We are looking for a new executive director. The posting is going up very soon. We're hopefully going to draw national attention to the opportunity to come and work in a regulatory body here in Massachusetts, and still what I think is an emerging and dynamic market. There are some things that we don't have any control over, and obviously, the suspension of the chair, that's out of our control. I will tell you that in the intervening period, the other 4 commissioners promulgated the regulations around Chapter 180, so that we did that on time and within our allowed time frame after the bill was signed. I will tell you that every day our entire team, our investigators, our licensing folks, are still doing the job day in and day out. So we're focused on what we can do and what we can control, and again, keeping to our mission and keeping to the great work that our entire team does. I'm still working on social consumption. I'm looking at a host of other issues that folks in the industry have brought to our attention. Thursday, we're going up to Beacon Hill to have our annual State of Cannabis legislative hearing. Or legislative event. So we continue to do our outreach to the legislature and budget season, tight, tough budget season. But, the work goes on.
Great. Payton, Bruce, thank you so much for coming in today and discussing this. I think we've brought up a lot of great issues about this, considering the amount of money that cannabis is generating in the state. Some people giggle about this stuff, but to me, it's deadly serious. There is now jobs that have been created. There's tax money that has been created, a revenue stream that didn't exist just a few years ago. So I really think that people need to hear the serious side and what's happening in this business. And I thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
And folks, this has been another edition of Government Matters right here on Focus Springfield.